Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology by Deirdre Cooper Owens is about how racism and sexism were the basis of the formation of gynecology in antebellum era America, along with the use of Irish immigrants as experiments for white male doctors to experiment and learn more about women's reproductive systems and how to fix their imperfections.
Yeah, so like in the book it talks about how enslaved women were used as experiments basically. So like the doctors would like conduct experiments and surgeries on enslaved women that they would then transfer the knowledge of those surgeries to white women who they viewed as more delicate and like more susceptible to pain, because they viewed African American women as like stronger and less susceptible to feelings of pain.
I read the book Heavy by Kai Slayman, and it's just about, well, it's a memoir, and he's writing to his mom about his whole life story, and the title Heavy basically sums it up like really well. He just talks about racism in America and how that's affected his life so deeply, and also his dealings with anorexia and the health problems in his own family and gambling problems, and his early introduction to rape in his community and by some of the people that he was around, and how he's just dealt with that, and how he's become a teacher and a professor, and how he's still trying to power through all the things that are just trying to weigh down on him. And yeah, one thing that I really liked about the book is just like when I finished reading it, I kind of just imagined him walking in to like a doctor's office, and like maybe me being a doctor in this situation, and just thinking of like how, you know, people come in with their stories, and you know, here's his story that's very deep, very honest, and full of a lot of struggle. And I was just thinking about how you know, a lot of people have like their different struggles in life and the things that they're dealing with, and you know, when we as future doctors are going to be dealing with people and helping people, like they come in with all these things maybe weighing down on them. And yeah, reading this book just helped me, I guess, helped open my eyes to how people have really been affected by some of the issues happening in America. So it's very good.
That's a lot like in the afterword with Cooper Owens. She discusses how she is infertile and how she needs to go through gynecological treatments in order to have a baby with her husband, but she would go through procedures like opening her cervix without anesthesia because she is a black woman, and they still assume that she is more tolerant to pain, and how everything from the beginnings of gynecology is still true today, how they are treating black women differently than white women in gynecology and in their treatments as well.
Yeah. I think a lot of that is because there's such a history, like, that the, like, racism, that, like, people still believe that black women are, like, physically stronger and more capable of handling pain than white women, is because that idea has been ingrained into like the American society, like since the beginning. And in the beginning of gynecology, that was the like initial belief. And so like I think it just really shows how those ideas still like permeate and how like real they still are. Yeah, so it's really interesting.
That's probably helped with how early gynecological experiments were explained in medical journals and medical research, because they wrote directly into those papers how tolerant to pain and how strong these women were, but they are still seen as inferior, even if they are seen as what Ms. Owens calls medical super bodies, and that is why they're used. They are seen as stronger, but still weak, inferior race. And because that is written into those medical papers, and that is what has been taught to doctors and throughout their education, this is what they have learned, and it is ingrained to them still today because they're still reading those papers.
Yeah.
Kais actually talks about his grandma, and she had to go into the doctor's office like for her head and stuff. And yeah, there's just like this misconception and understanding that he was talking about that, especially like with older African American women, that they don't need as much help as like other people. Kind of like what you guys are like saying, that like they aren't as susceptible to pain, but. You know, he was like explaining this story, and she was literally like screaming because of the pain she was going through and screaming for mercy to God about it. But yeah, and she was like taken care of, but I don't think very well. So yeah, you know, I just thought of that connection.
And also I think it's weird how like people still believe that even though there is no real science to prove that, and like I don't know, I just think that's really weird how that is still a misconception.
Yes. It is definitely difficult to get over what people are taught and how they're taught to view things. And even if, with how all of this is, it's just very, very difficult for all people to come out of that. It's just what's been taught, and we have to kind of reprogram everything and reprogram how we think about all of this in order to make it better, more ethical, and more equal.
I like this quote from the book, and it says, so he was talking about like his teachers and when he was like learning in class when he was younger. And he says about his teachers, they never once said the words economic inequality, housing discrimination, sexual violence, mass incarceration, homophobia, empire, mass eviction, post-traumatic stress disorder, white supremacy, patriarchy, neo-confederacy, mental health, or parental abuse, yet every student and teacher at that school lived in a world shaped by those words. And that's just like really powerful, because I think that really highlights like a lot of the problems with systematic inequality and like oppression and stuff, is just like how we don't even bring up some of these topics that are obviously so ingrained in our society and affecting so many people in like really negative ways. But like even early on, like in our education system and everything, sometimes we don't even talk about these things, even though they're so important. And yeah, and I feel like that affects like the medical world too, like very much so. And I think it's hopefully getting better now, but I don't know.
And like those are the factors that like completely shape a person's life and completely like change the quality of a person's life too. And
It's definitely one of the bigger social determinants, I think, are the stereotypes and the ideas we get when we just first look at a person, what we see when we first see a person. These are the ideas that you give your doctors, your families, your friends, everyone you meet is what you look like. And with race is a huge part of the inequality in medicine and in the world, and that social determinant has a big factor on how you are treated by doctors.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think it's like really horrible too that like doctors who are like supposed to be the people to take care of others and to like they're expected to be really caring and empathetic people because that's their job.
You're putting your life into their hands.
Yeah, and like the fact that doctors can have those like really horrible and wrong ideas about certain groups of people, and to have like the lives of those people placed in their hands is just really like unnerving.
For sure. Another thing from this book that I thought was interesting, so he says, there wasn't a gross or anything approximating a gross in our vocabulary or our stories. Bodies at Holy Family were heavier than the bodies at St. Richard, and none of those heavy bodies were gross. So yeah, he's just talking about like at school and like his physical weight and everything, and he never like thought of himself, I guess, as gross. But as we see with like the story and the progression of his life, that starts to change, and he starts to deal with anorexia, And then so moving on like 100 pages later, he says, whenever I looked at myself in the mirror, I still saw a 319-pound fat black boy from Jackson. When I touched myself or saw how much I weighed or my percentage of body fat, I knew I created a body. I knew I made a body disappear. I wanted to know exactly how much I weighed so I could decide if it was okay for me to eat or drink before going to bed. And yeah, we just see like as culture starts to like shape how he sees himself, he starts to deal with these issues of anorexia and everything like that, and he gets to the point where he just wants to control that part of him so desperately. And it just becomes a huge obsession. But like obviously it's not because he had some problem with like his individual will, it's because of all these things like pressing down on him that affect him in this way that, you know, makes it so his health is kind of deteriorating. There's so many factors involved, and I think that's really important too, like in medicine, knowing when a patient comes in that it's not like all on them, like what they're dealing with. It's not like they're being stupid or like everything's their fault or they're picking or choosing to be the way they are, but it's because like there's so many things just like weighing down on people, especially like in the context of these stories, like with African American people, just how racism is just like weighing down, and how people maybe make them view themselves like how culture is and says like how this is beautiful and this isn't, and how that just really affects people. And I saw that like a lot in this book, just how all those things were really like, they were heavy, like as the title says. So yeah, and just how it affected him. So, which that's like a social determinant of health as well, just like, yeah, going back to race and also like culture, and I'd say like economy as well. He was like dealing with when he was younger, not having a lot of money available, so a lot of the foods maybe he was eating weren't necessarily the best, or like when he did have access to food, he would eat as much as he could, because you know, you don't know what tomorrow will look like, so that just kind of followed him through the rest of his life as well.
That's a lot like how the women described in this book are, they see their value as everyone else sees their value, like how Case said in Heavy, and their value was ingrained in their reproductive system and their ability to breed and make more slaves and to make more children. And even when they were sick, their value dropped. They were economic products, and when they were damaged by gynecological illnesses, that was horrible to the finances of their owner, but that made them even more precious and valuable to the doctors who were experimenting and creating the field of gynecology itself. And in order to stay economically viable and to be bought and sold, these women would hide their illnesses and would hide everything wrong about their reproductive systems in order to keep their value and to stay in high regards with their owners. And so that they wouldn't have to go through these experiments that they didn't want, and that these doctors were putting onto them and forcing them. They would even strap these women down to tables in order to do these experiments and to fix these gynecological illnesses that were depleting their value as slaves, but were increasing their value as medical superbodies.
Yeah, I think from like both of these books that it just like really highlights, I don't know, like how we might understand when someone comes in to maybe get some medical care, how there might be this like lack of trust in a doctor, which is kind of our job to like gain the trust of a patient. But I think like genuinely gain trust in everything, and knowing like that there's these issues that are so rooted still in the medical world, and how understanding them maybe will help us fight against issues more so, and help us grow in like empathy for people and be an advocate for patients rather than hidden agendas maybe behind medicine, or maybe not so hidden agendas, but either way, just just being aware of these things and how they shape people that we might be like helping later down the road, or even in volunteering and stuff like that, and just like knowing people's stories.
These stories are a lot of what we've talked about in our class about narrative medicine and how that has a big impact on everything with between a diagnosis and a prognosis and the treatment of patients, you need to understand these stories, and these stories are what will help fix these things in the future. And a part of these stories is the trauma that they've all gone through, and the trauma that has caused all of this hurt that these doctors are supposed to fix and to at least lessen. And it is very hard to do that when you have a hidden agenda, such as these doctors in antebellum era America, when they are trying to make names for themselves, and that was their primary goal. And to make this a field of medicine that will, their only goal was to make white women better. So they decided to use those who are inferior, and such as what they saw were to be the black slaves and Irish immigrants, who they, in this book it says that they were regarded as between human and lower primate. They weren't even really regarded as human. They were just things to use. And this trauma is the root of these stories and the root of medicine today.
And I think it's really important to recognize this trauma if we want to move on, like you said, and like earn the trust of patients again, especially patients of these affected groups by like this history of like trauma and oppression and experimentation. And I think it's just really important to recognize all these horrible things that happened, because I feel like to not recognize it would be saying like, oh, like we can move past that.
And it doesn't matter. And not be completely ignorant.
And that's why I think like the history of gynecology is so important, because gynecology started from the abuse of enslaved women, and I think that that's really important to recognize.
I had no idea like that this happened until like talking to you guys about this book. So it's like very shocking to like hear in like our American history and everything. And it made me think of this quote on page 231 of Heavy, and it says, "For a few seconds, I remember that the most abusive parts of our nation obsessively neglect yesterday while peddling impossibility." And that just, I think, goes with this. Like, I've never actually heard anything about these issues. And it's just like, we hear often of like, oh, we're like going so far in the medical world and accomplishing so much, and, you know, we're on a path of like curing cancer and blah, 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 which is just fine and great in many ways, but we just neglect what happened in history and don't talk about it and like cover it all up, which I don't think that's helping at all. It's just going to make things worse down the road, and it's so important to know about these issues to really make medicine what it needs to be, which I think is like, it's more than just science, and it's more than just, dealing with disease. It's helping people and help serve people and be with them as they face like some of the hardest issues in their lives and stuff like that. And so it's like, I think I said this earlier, but like being an advocate for them. But to do that, I think we definitely need to know the history of medicine and these different specialties and stuff. Because I had no idea that this even happened. But I know that it's still gonna be like somehow in the structure of gynecology even today. And I don't know, how do we change that?
I think it's really interesting too, seeing how the history of gynecology and medicine in general is written, because like in this book there are pictures of like the doctors who like did experiments on enslaved women, and their portraits are like very like detailed, and you could tell that like a painter came in and like did their like portraits and stuff, and they're just like ingrained in history and they're celebrated. But a lot of those doctors like raped their patients and did horrible experiments and surgeries that really like did not help the patients, but really hurt them physically and emotionally and mentally. And so I think it's really interesting how like history is painted to be so like wonderful, at least like from the perspective of like white men and stuff. And like all of these gynecologists who did those things were like white male doctors.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's because it's just so hard to talk about, and it just makes most people uncomfortable to talk about the trauma that these women and other people who were experimented on for other fields, all their trauma was horrible, and it's just so hard to talk about, and it makes many people uncomfortable, and people tend to shy away from those topics because of how uncomfortable it is to talk about. And if we don't get over how uncomfortable it is, and if we don't talk about it, then we can't move on. Because the first step to moving on is to discuss these things and to accept that this happened, and to find ways to make these sacrifices worth something. We need to acknowledge these people, and although I understand that these weren't sacrifices willingly made, they still need to be acknowledged and made into something beautiful that can help heal women of today. And I think that is what these people would want.
I thought it was really interesting too how, like in this book, they talked about how a lot of the diseased ovaries and things from the enslaved women were taken, and they're still in museums, and they're like celebrated for being like body parts of women are like celebrated for like the medical advances of it, but the way that those like organs were obtained is really like unethical, and that like isn't addressed, because like multiple times in here it talks about how like the ovaries and like other organs were like taken and like used for like medical research and stuff, and like that, like those, like that just wasn't like acknowledged, like the like pain of like having those organs forcibly like removed, and also like the lack of consent of like having like just having like an organ like on display, you know, it's just really like dehumanizing.
And the human part of all of this is what medicine is about, or what it should be about, is the humanity of our patients and the humanity of the people who doctors are supposed to serve and take care of and to protect from these illnesses. And instead, these women's body parts are on display as if they are no longer human, no longer a part of someone or something that was just made. These people were made to be experiments and to be tools, and they had almost lost their humanity, but these women had also worked to gain that humanity back by controlling who they marry, who they love, and sometimes even planning their own pregnancies. And they had found ways to gain their humanity back, but once these women died and their bodies were put on display and used in research, that humanity was lost. And it is very difficult to gain that back when you no longer have anything to say other than what is said about you in these medical journals and medical papers. And that is all we will know, because we can't go back and change things and hear what they have to say.
Yeah. I think if I could just like say one last thing, it's just like being a doctor is like role of healer. Like that's what, you know, we're going to be going into. And I think that it's a good path, that healing doesn't just have to be like, you know, like physical, like disease, or like, you know, a bone breaking or something like that. But we're going to be in a position where maybe our role of healer can maybe even go further than that, and hopefully like we can be part of that process of I guess healing the nation, which sounds like a really big like crazy thing, but I think, you know, there's a lot that we could do, that we can take from this class and from these books, and like the things we're going to be dealing with in the future and stuff, and maybe apply that when we're doctors, and maybe just help in this healing process, and hopefully help people see like the beauty within themselves, and how we really are all like equally made in the image of God, and that hasn't played out very well in history, obviously. Like, there has been so much oppression and so much darkness, especially from, you know, white people, affecting the lives of African people and other minorities. But, you know, maybe we can be part of this process of healing, more than just like, yeah, just disease and stuff, but like everything, hopefully.
I think that's a great place to end.
Okay.